A father's hidden pain. It was a chilly Friday evening when Tony Wilson arrived home earlier than usual. His wife, Laura, glanced up from the kitchen, surprised. Tony rarely came home before sunset, especially in the middle of a tough work week. "Hey, you're home early," Laura said, wiping her hands on a dish towel and stepping toward him. But as she got closer, she froze. Something was wrong. Tony's usually warm brown eyes were distant, almost hollow. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie missing, and his hair, which was always neatly styled, looked like he had run his fingers through it too many times. "Tony?" she asked softly. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked past her and headed straight for the small nursery down the hallway where their 2-year-old daughter, Mia, was peacefully napping in her crib. Laura watched in confusion as her husband stood over their child, his broad shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she heard him say, "You are mine. No matter what, you are mine." Tears welled in his eyes, his fingers gently caressing Mia's chubby cheeks. Laura's stomach twisted with unease. What was happening? She had never seen Tony like this. He was a man of strength, the type to always have a reassuring smile, even on difficult days. He was a devoted husband, a loving father. So why did he look like a man whose world had just crumbled? Laura took a hesitant step forward. "Tony, talk to me." Nothing. He just kept looking at Mia as if memorizing every detail of her tiny face. After a few moments, he sighed heavily and walked out of the nursery without another word. Laura hurried after him. "Tony, please, say something." He collapsed onto the couch in the living room, rubbing his temples. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Laura, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Laura's breath caught in her throat. "Of course." Tony exhaled sharply before looking at her with an expression that made her heart pound. "Is Mia really mine?" Laura felt like the ground had been yanked from beneath her feet. "What?" she gasped. Tony clenched his jaw, struggling to control his emotions. "I don't want to believe it. God knows I don't. But Charles came to my office today." At the mention of her ex-boyfriend's name, Laura's hands grew clammy. "What did he say?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Tony's voice trembled. "He said Maya isn't my daughter, that she's his." The room spun. Laura clutched the back of the couch to steady herself. "Tony, that's a lie," she said, but her voice was shaking. He looked at her, desperate yet conflicted. "Then why have you been talking to him?" Laura's heart stopped. Tony reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He turned the screen toward her, and her stomach sank. There, in plain sight, was a list of recent calls, her number repeatedly showing up under Charles' name. Laura's lips parted, but no words came out. "You've been talking to him, Laura," Tony said, his voice laced with hurt. "Why?" She swallowed hard, feeling like a deer caught in headlights. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." Tony's voice cracked. Laura took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Charles started calling me out of nowhere. He wanted to meet up, but I refused. I only answered to tell him to leave me alone. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to worry you." Tony's eyes burned with unshed tears. "And the pictures?" Laura's pulse roared in her ears. "What pictures?" Tony reached for his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. He dumped the contents onto the coffee table, and Laura's knees buckled. There were photographs of her and Charles at a hotel. The date, just 1 week before their wedding. Laura felt like she couldn't breathe. "Tony, I swear to you, it's not what it looks like." "Then explain it," he pleaded. She sat down, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the photos. "I met up with Charles that day because he begged me for closure. He said he needed to see me one last time before I married you. I agreed, but nothing happened." Tony rubbed his face. "Then why did he come to me today, swearing Mia is his?" Laura's chest ached. "Because he's bitter. He wants to ruin our marriage." Tony stared at the ceiling, silent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "I need to know the truth, Laura. I need a paternity test." Tears spilled down Laura's cheeks. "Tony, you don't have to do this. I promise you. Mia is yours." "I want to believe that," he whispered. "But I need proof." Laura's heart shattered. She had never cheated. She had never betrayed Tony. But Charles' manipulative actions had successfully planted a seed of doubt in her husband's mind. And now, no matter how much she pleaded, Tony wouldn't be able to rest until he had undeniable proof. The next morning, he scheduled the DNA test. For the next week, their household was tense. Tony still held Mia in his arms, still kissed her goodnight, but there was something different. A hesitation, a pain behind his eyes. And Laura? She barely slept. She knew the results would prove Mia was Tony's, but the damage had already been done. Then the email came. Tony read it in silence, his hands trembling. Then he looked at Laura, and she knew. Mia was his. A sob escaped her lips, and she threw herself into his arms. He held her tightly, murmuring apologies into her hair. But even though the truth was clear, the scars of doubt lingered. And neither of them knew that the real test of their love was yet to come. Because that very night, when Laura checked the hidden camera in their living room, she saw something that made her burst into tears. And soon, the entire world would see it too. A father's silent struggle. The tension in the Wilson household was far from over. Even though the DNA results had confirmed what Laura had been saying all along, Mia was Tony's biological daughter. The damage had already been done. It wasn't that Tony didn't trust Laura. Deep down, he believed her. But trust, once shaken, was hard to fully restore. And Laura could feel it. The way Tony hesitated before holding her hand. The way his once affectionate kisses had become brief and uncertain. The way he stared at Mia sometimes, as if he was trying to relearn what it meant to be her father. It hurt. But Laura had vowed to be patient. One night, as they lay in bed, she turned toward him. "Tony, talk to me. You haven't been the same since all this started." Tony exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what to say, Laura. I'm trying. I really am." "I know," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "But you're distant. And Mia, she notices it too." Tony flinched. "She's just a toddler," he said defensively. "She doesn't understand anything." Laura sighed. "She understands more than you think. She's been extra fussy lately. You used to be her favorite person, but now she barely lets you hold her." Tony sat up, running a hand down his face. He knew Laura was right. He felt it. Whenever he reached out to pick Mia up, she would hesitate. Whenever he came home, she would run to Laura first instead of him. It was as if she could sense that something had changed in their home. "I just don't know how to fix this," Tony admitted. Laura squeezed his hand. "Then let's figure it out together." Tony turned to her, his eyes full of uncertainty. "What if I never feel the same again?" The words stung, but Laura refused to let them shake her. "You will," she said firmly, "because deep down, you love Mia more than anything." Tony let out a shaky breath, nodding. Maybe Laura was right. Maybe he just needed time. The hidden camera. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned for hours before finally deciding to check the home security cameras. Mia had been particularly fussy that day, and Laura wanted to see what had been happening while she was out running errands. She tapped on the living room camera and hit play. At first, the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. The living room was empty, the dim glow from the nightlight casting soft shadows on the walls. Then, Mia's crying echoed through the speakers. Laura's heart clenched. The camera showed Tony appearing in the doorway. His face was weary, his shoulders slumped. He walked into Mia's nursery and picked her up. "Mia, please, stop crying," he murmured, rocking her gently. But the toddler wasn't having it. She wailed, her little fists pounding against his chest. Tony sighed. "I know, baby girl. I know." Laura watched, expecting him to just pace back and forth like he usually did. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of simply rocking her, Tony started dancing. At first it was just small movements, shuffling from side to side, swaying gently. But as Mia's cries continued, he escalated. Tony turned on the Bluetooth speaker and played one of Mia's favorite songs. Then, he went all in. He twirled around, moving his arms dramatically, doing exaggerated hip swings and silly robot moves. He even threw in a ridiculous moonwalk that made Mia pause mid-cry. Laura couldn't believe what she was seeing. Mia blinked at her father, confused by the absurdity of his dance. And then she giggled. It was small at first, a tiny chuckle, but when Tony did a ridiculously uncoordinated spin move and almost fell over, Mia burst into laughter. It was the first time in days that Laura had seen her daughter so joyful. Tony kept going. He lifted Mia into the air like she was Simba from The Lion King, twirling her around before pulling her into a tight embrace. "I love you, Mia," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Mia, still giggling, rested her head on his shoulder. Laura's chest ached. Tears blurred her vision as she watched her husband fall in love with his daughter all over again, completely unaware that anyone was watching. This wasn't just a father comforting his child. This was a man fighting to heal himself. And Laura realized something important at that moment. Tony wasn't distant because he doubted Mia was his. He was distant because he was ashamed. He hated himself for ever questioning it. And the guilt had been eating him alive. Going viral. Laura saved the footage and hesitated for a moment. Then, on impulse, she uploaded a short clip to her personal social media account with the caption, "A father's love is priceless." He didn't know there was a camera watching. But this moment melted my heart. She wasn't expecting much. Maybe a few likes from close friends and family. But by the next morning, the video had exploded. Thousands of people had liked, shared, and commented. And the responses were overwhelming. "This is the most beautiful thing I've seen today. I'm crying. The way he looks at her, this is true love. We need more fathers like this in the world." Laura's heart pounded as she saw the numbers climbing. 50,000 views, 100,000 views, 500,000 views. By noon, news outlets had already started sharing the video. And by the end of the day, a headline was trending on social media. "Father's heartwarming dance with his daughter goes viral. And the reason behind it will break your heart." Laura's hands trembled as she turned to Tony, who was completely unaware of what had happened. She cleared her throat. "Oh, Tony." He looked up from his coffee. "Yeah." She hesitated. Then she flicked her phone toward him. Tony's eyes widened as he saw the viral post. His face drained of color. "Laura," he croaked, "what did you do?" A father's love under the spotlight. The moment Tony saw the video on Laura's phone, his heart nearly stopped. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the thousands of comments, his mind struggling to process what was happening. This can't be real," he muttered. Laura bit her lip, unsure of how he would react. "Tony, you filmed this." His voice was soft, but there was an edge of disbelief in it. "No, not exactly," she said quickly. "It was on the baby monitor. I wasn't spying on you. I just..." Tony exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. His emotions were all over the place. Part of him was embarrassed. He hadn't known anyone was watching. That moment with Mia was supposed to be private, just between them. But another part of him, that part was terrified. What if people misunderstand? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Misunderstand what?" Laura frowned. Tony hesitated. "The way I've been distant lately. The way I was struggling before." His voice broke slightly. "What if people think I'm a bad father?" Laura's heart ached. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Tony, look at the comments. Read what people are actually saying. They're not judging you. They're celebrating you." Tony swallowed hard. His eyes flickered back to the screen. Comment after comment. "This made me cry. What a beautiful father. He doesn't even know he's being watched. This is pure love. Mia will grow up knowing she is truly loved." His vision blurred for a moment. How could they see it so clearly when he had been drowning in self-doubt for weeks? His thumb hovered over the screen. How many people have seen this? Laura hesitated. Almost 2 million views now. Tony's breath hitched. 2 million? His voice cracked. Laura nodded. "And it's growing. News outlets are picking it up. People are sharing it everywhere." Tony leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. He had never expected this. Never expected the world to witness his struggle. Never expected to become an unintentional symbol of fatherhood overnight. The backlash begins. At first, the viral video was a beautiful thing. But with fame comes scrutiny. And it didn't take long before the negativity crept in. A few days later, Laura came across a comment thread that sent chills down her spine. Something about this seems off. The wife just happened to have cameras set up. Why was she recording him without his knowledge? What if this is all staged for views? Laura's stomach twisted. People were twisting their story, making it into something ugly. But it didn't stop there. As she scrolled, her breath caught at another comment. "Anyone else think this guy looks kind of guilty? Why did he react like that to the video? Almost like he was hiding something." Laura's heart dropped. She knew her husband. She knew what was in his heart. But strangers on the internet, they didn't know Tony. They only saw a man in a vulnerable moment. And some of them were twisting the narrative in the worst way possible. Tony faces the pressure. When Laura showed him the comments, Tony went pale. His hands balled into fists as he scrolled through the accusations. "They think I'm some kind of fraud," he whispered. Laura's eyes filled with anger. "They don't know you. They don't know what we've been through." Tony shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Once something like this starts, people will believe whatever they want." Laura clenched her jaw. "So what? Are we just supposed to let them say whatever they want about you?" Tony let out a shaky breath. "I don't know, Laura." His voice was quiet, almost defeated. "I never wanted any of this." Laura softened. "I know." Tony closed his eyes for a long moment. "Do you think Mia will see this one day?" Laura hesitated before nodding. "Probably." Tony exhaled. "Then I need to make sure that when she does, she sees the truth." The interview that changed everything. A few days later, Tony was invited to do a live interview with one of the biggest talk shows in the country. At first, he wanted to decline. But after seeing the accusations spreading online, he realized something. If he didn't speak up now, people would write his story for him. So, with Laura by his side, he agreed. The interview took place in a grand studio, with bright lights and cameras pointed at him from every angle. As the host smiled warmly and began asking questions, Tony took a deep breath. And then, he told his story. He spoke about the doubts he had faced, the guilt, the shame of ever questioning his wife. He spoke about how deeply he loved Mia, so much that the thought of her not being his had nearly broken him. And then he spoke about the night of the viral video. "I wasn't trying to be perfect. I wasn't trying to be a hero," Tony admitted. "I was just a father, trying to find his way back to his daughter." The audience fell silent. Even the host looked emotional. And when the interview aired, something unexpected happened. The narrative shifted. The negativity began to fade, replaced with overwhelming support. Because when people saw the real Tony, they believed in him. A new beginning. The viral fame eventually settled down. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be after something like this. But something had changed. Tony felt lighter. He no longer carried the guilt in his heart. He no longer looked at Mia with hesitation. Because now he knew something with absolute certainty. He was always meant to be her father. One evening, as he tucked Mia into bed, she reached for his face with her tiny hands. "Daddy," she said softly. Tony smiled. "Yes, baby." She giggled. "Dance?" His heart swelled, and without hesitation, Tony turned on the music. And they danced. Shadows of the past and the strength of a father. Tony thought the worst was over. After the interview, the negativity surrounding the viral video had mostly faded. People had seen the real story, his struggles, his doubts, his love for Mia. But the internet never forgets, and neither does the past. A ghost from yesterday. One evening, while Tony was playing with Mia in the living room, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "You're enjoying the spotlight now, aren't you? You always were good at pretending." Tony's stomach twisted. He knew that number. Charles. Laura's ex. The man who had tried to destroy their family. Tony clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around his phone. Not again. Not when he had finally started feeling like himself again. He debated whether to respond. Then, another message. "You think this is over. You have no idea what's coming." Tony's pulse quickened. His first instinct was to ignore it, to move forward. But something inside him whispered, "What if he's not bluffing?" Laura walked into the room, holding a cup of tea. She immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. "Tony," she asked, setting the cup down. "What's wrong?" He hesitated. Then, with a deep sigh, he handed her the phone. Her face drained of color as she read the messages. "No," she whispered. "He can't just. Why now? Why is he doing this?" Tony exhaled slowly, trying to keep his anger in check. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not going to let him mess with us again." Laura shivered. "I thought he was gone," she murmured. "I thought after the DNA test, he'd finally leave us alone." Tony sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "He's trying to get in our heads," he said firmly. "But listen to me, Laura. He doesn't get to do that anymore." Laura nodded, but Tony could still see the fear in her eyes. And deep down, he felt it too. A threat unfolds. The next day, something unsettling happened. As Tony was leaving for work, he noticed a car parked just down the street. A black sit-in. Tinted windows. Not moving. At first, he brushed it off. But when he came home that evening, the same car was there. Watching. Waiting. The cold chill ran down his spine. He didn't tell Laura. Not yet. She had been through enough already. Instead, he made a silent promise to himself. Whatever Charles was planning, he wouldn't let it happen. The unexpected confrontation. A few days later, Tony received an unmarked envelope at work. Inside was a single photograph of him and Mia, taken from outside their house. Tony's blood ran cold. His heart pounded as he flipped the photo over. Scrawled in black ink was a single sentence. "You took what's mine. Now I take what's yours." Tony saw red. His first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped him. Charles was cunning. He was manipulative. And Tony knew exactly what he was trying to do, scare him into making a mistake. But he refused to play that game. Instead, he took matters into his own hands. A father's instinct. That night, Tony sat awake in the dark, watching the baby monitor, listening for any sound outside the house. His mind raced with possibilities. Would Charles try to break in? Would he snatch Mia from daycare? Every scenario made his hands tighten into fists of pure rage. He wasn't just protecting his family anymore. This was war. At 2 a.m., Tony heard something. A soft rustling outside. He grabbed the bat he had placed beside the door and moved toward the window. His heart hammered. He pulled back the curtain and froze. There was a shadow in the driveway. A tall figure standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. Tony's grip on the bat tightened. And then, The figure stepped forward, right into the light. Charles. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. Tony's breath came in short bursts. Enough. Face to face with the devil. Tony threw open the front door. He strode right up to Charles, his rage barely contained. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Tony growled. Charles smirked. "Good to see you too, Tony." "Get away from my house." Charles tilted his head. "Or what?" he said, almost playfully. Tony's fists clenched. "You have no idea what I'm capable of," he said darkly. "You come near my family again, and you'll find out." Charles chuckled. "Relax," he said. "I'm just here to talk." Tony didn't believe him for a second, but he crossed his arms, muscles tense. "Talk," he said, "and then you leave." Charles's smile faded. "I know what you did," he said. Tony frowned. "What are you talking about?" Charles's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "You faked the DNA test, didn't you?" Tony felt a bolt of shock run through him. "Are you insane?" he snapped. Charles leaned in. "I know the truth," he whispered. "Mia is mine." Tony's chest tightened. His pulse pounded in his ears. But then something clicked. This wasn't about Mia. It was about control. Charles wanted power over him. He wanted to make Tony doubt again. But not this time. Tony took a slow, steady breath. "You're pathetic," he said, his voice calm but deadly. Charles's smirk faltered. "Mia is mine," Tony continued, stepping closer. "Not because of a test, not because of blood." His voice hardened. "Because I'm her father." Charles's jaw tensed. "You're not her real dad," he sneered. Tony's eyes darkened. "You don't get to decide that," he said. For the first time, Charles looked uncertain. And Tony knew he had won. Without another word, Charles turned and walked away. Tony watched until he disappeared into the night. Then, finally, he let out a shaky breath. It was over. For now. But Tony knew. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. A father's breaking point. Tony barely slept after his confrontation with Charles. He stayed up, listening for any sign of movement outside. Every shadow, every creak of the house, sent his heart racing. What if Charles came back? What if he wasn't bluffing? Tony had stood his ground, but he knew Charles too well. He wasn't the type to walk away empty-handed. And that was what terrified him the most. Because Mia wasn't just a battle to Charles, she was a prize. And Tony wasn't going to lose. A new fear. The next morning, Tony was exhausted. Laura immediately noticed. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked, concern in her voice. Tony rubbed his face. "No." Laura sighed, sitting next to him on the couch. "Tony, we need to do something." "I know." Laura hesitated, then spoke softly. "We need to go to the police." Tony looked at her. She was right, but something inside him resisted. They had already gotten a restraining order against Charles once, and what had that done? Nothing. The law wouldn't stop a man like Charles. Tony clenched his jaw. "I don't think the police can help us, Laura," he admitted. "We need to handle this ourselves." Laura frowned. "What do you mean?" Tony exhaled, staring down at his hands. "I mean, we need to be ready. If Charles comes near our family again, I won't just stand there and do nothing." Laura shivered. She knew Tony wasn't a violent man, but she also knew he would do anything to protect Mia. And that scared her. Because Charles wasn't just dangerous, he was unpredictable. And unpredictable men were the most terrifying of all. The warning. That afternoon, Laura took Mia to the park while Tony went to the grocery store. Everything felt normal. Until Tony got to his car. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. His stomach twisted as he grabbed it. There were only 2 words written on it. Checkmate. Tony's hands tightened around the note. His pulse pounded. He scanned the parking lot, looking for any sign of Charles. Nothing. But he knew what this meant. Charles was watching, and that made Tony's blood boil. The breaking point. That night, Tony sat by Mia's crib, watching her sleep. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. She had no idea that a storm was brewing around her, a storm that Tony was determined to stop. Then, his phone buzzed. Another message. From Charles. You think you can keep her from me. You can't. I always get what I want. Tony snapped. He had had enough. Without a word, he stood up and grabbed his car keys. Laura saw him heading for the door. Tony, where are you going? She asked. Tony's face was dark with rage. I'm ending this. Laura's eyes widened. No, you are not going after him. Tony stopped. He won't stop, Laura, he said, voice low. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. Laura grabbed his hand, pleading. I know, but please, don't do something you'll regret. Tony closed his eyes. He was so angry, so tired. But Laura was right. If he went after Charles now, he'd be playing right into his hands. And that was exactly what Charles wanted. Slowly, Tony set his keys down. I just want this to be over, he whispered. Laura hugged him tight. I know, she said. We'll figure it out. Together. A dangerous plan. The next morning, Tony did something he never thought he'd do. He called an old friend, Derek, a private investigator. If the police couldn't stop Charles, Tony would find another way. And Derek was the best. When Derek picked up, Tony wasted no time. I need you to dig into someone, he said. Derek was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. Tony, are you sure you want to do this? Tony's grip on the phone tightened. Yes. Derek exhaled. All right. Give me a name. Tony's jaw clenched. Charles. Derek whistled. Sounds serious. You have no idea. Derek was quiet for a moment, then said, I'll see what I can find. Tony hung up. For the first time in days, he felt like he was finally taking control. A shocking revelation. 2 days later, Derek called back. And what he told Tony changed everything. Tony, Derek said, his voice serious. You need to hear this. Go on. Derek took a deep breath. Charles, he's not who you think he is. Tony frowned. What are you talking about? Derek hesitated. He's not just some jealous ex. He has a record. A long one. Tony's stomach dropped. What? Derek's voice was grim. Assault. Fraud. And there's more. Tony's heart pounded. What else? Derek hesitated. Then he dropped the bombshell. There was a paternity fraud case filed against him 3 years ago. Tony's breath hitched. What? Derek continued. A woman accused him of lying about being the father of her child to gain custody. When she exposed him, he disappeared. Tony's blood ran cold. This wasn't about Mia. It had never been about Mia. Charles didn't want her because she was his. He wanted her because he couldn't accept losing. He was obsessed. And that made him dangerous. Tony swallowed hard. We need to stop him, he said. Derek sighed. I'm already working on it. Tony clenched his jaw. He didn't know how this would end. But one thing was certain. Charles had made a mistake. He had underestimated a father's love. And that was something Tony would make him regret.